Texas. We're here live at the South by Southwest Festival for 3 back-to-back Democratic presidential candidate town halls. The very first Democrat who announced his candidacy in the 2020 race, former Congressman Joh Delaney of Maryland. He has already visited each of Iowa's 99 counties, and here tonight, he'll take questions from voters from across the country in his first nationally televised town hall. In our audience are Democrats and independents who say that they plan to vote in the Democratic primaries and caucuses. Please welcome, without further delay, former Congressman Joh Delaney.
Jake,
good to see you.
Thank you.
Have a seat, please.
Up now, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. I'm Dana Bash. Tonight, a conversation with a candidate who would make history. 37-year-old Tulsi Gabbard would be the youngest president, the first woman in the Oval Office, and Major Gabbard would also be the first Iraq War veteran to serve as commander-in-chief. She'll take questions from Democrats and independents who say they plan to vote in the Democratic primaries. Without further ado, please welcome Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard.
Thank you, everybody. Aloha. How are you, Dana?
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice
Thank
to see
you very much.
Have a seat.
Aloha.
The 37-year-old mayor of South Bend, Indiana, would make history as the youngest president ever elected, the first openly gay president. Lieutenant Buttigieg would also be the first veteran of the war in Afghanistan to serve as commander-in-chief. Tonight, Mayor Buttigieg will take questions from voters in his first nationally televised town hall. In our audience are Democrats and independents who say they plan to vote in the Democratic primaries and caucuses. Please welcome Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Good to see you again. Thanks so much. Have a seat. So you've been running for president for almost 2 years. What has getting an early head start on this process taught you, if anything?
Well, it's given me an amazing opportunity to listen to people, which is in many ways the most important thing for people who have the privilege to lead our country to do, to hear what's going on in communities, listen to the average American and hear what their concerns are and what's happening in their communities. So not only has it given me an opportunity to introduce myself to people, Jake, but it's given me the opportunity to really listen about what's really happening in our country.
So let's start with what's around your neck, because
yes.
My understanding is that you generally wear your lei when you're in Hawaii. We're not in Hawaii.
We are not, but I was fortunate enough to meet up with some folks from Hawaii yesterday. They were very kind enough to bring me a fresh lei from Hawaii, so I put it in the fridge and prayed that it would survive the night, and it did.
It looks great.
So
okay,
here we are.
We're going to get to the audience, but I just have to give you a little secret. So we were, in the prep for this, we were talking about how to pronounce the Hawaiian state fish, which apparently is a thing. I'm not just sort of doing this out of nowhere.
Are you ready to?
I'm ready. Can you do it?
I can do it. Can you?
Absolutely not. I'm from New Jersey. Go
okay.
for it.
Let me ask, how many people here know the state fish from Hawaii? Yeah? You want to say it with me? 1, 2, 3. Humu, humu, nuku, nuku, apua.
That's impressive.
There's a more simple one, though. Let's start with, can we hear a big aloha for everybody? Aloha. There we go. That one's easier.
All right. Before we get to the very important questions, I have an issue of paramount concern, okay? You really have to settle this, because you and your husband seem to have a disagreement on how to pronounce your last name.
Uh-oh.
According to your Twitter biographies, your husband says on Twitter, it's Buddha Judge. You have Boot Edge Edge. I don't want to get in the middle of a marital squabble.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
But how do you pronounce your last name?
Buttigieg.
Buttigieg.
Yeah, you say that 3 times fast, either way it comes out Buttigieg.
So Boot Edge Edge,
right?
not Buddha Judge.
Either way gets you there. Back home they just call me Mayor Pete.
Mayor Pete, all right. Well, very diplomatic. I feel like you said your way was right, but then you did not throw your husband under the bus, which is, I guarantee you that is the right path. I guarantee. So, but let's get to the serious questions. Let's get to it. The first question comes from Samuel Veloz. He's a junior at the University of Texas, Austin. Samuel.
Good evening.
Hey, Samuel.
As a businessman worth millions of dollars, how do you hope to garner support from an increasingly progressive and socialist electorate growing tired of the wealthy having so much power?
So Samuel, right? Thank you for that question. It's a great question. And I actually get it everywhere I go. I mean, people see that what's happening in our country is not really working for them. It's just not working for them. There's a lot of structural economic unfairness that's going on in our country right now. I have been successful, right? I've had the privilege of starting 2 businesses, right? Some of my business partners are here with me here tonight, creating thousands of jobs. But I grew up at a time when we had institutions in our society that really supported people, right? And I don't think we see that here today. I mean, I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad was an electrician. Neither of my parents went to college, right? I needed scholarships from my dad's union to give me the opportunity to get the education that I've received. And I had this amazing kind of American dream type life where I worked hard and played by the rules, but I lived at a time when we were supporting our citizens in doing it. It's one of the reasons I'm running for president. I want every kid in America to have the opportunities that I've had. You deserve those opportunities. Every young person in our country does. There's tremendous structural unfairness right now in our country, in our tax code. We have to start investing in people. We have to start investing in communities. I know how to do that, right? I know how to create jobs. We need entrepreneurs all over this country, right? That's what I was. I spent most of my business career helping small businesses grow. The Obama administration gave my company an award for the work we did in communities that were left behind. So I understand what this country needs right now. We need jobs everywhere. We need to invest in young people. We need to make sure people have the opportunities that I've had. And to do that, we need to invest in education and in communities. And I really understand how to do that. And that's why I've dedicated my life now to public service.
So let me ask,
I think I know what this country needs.
Let me ask you just to follow up, if I could. You have said that this primary is going to be a choice between, quote, socialism and a more just form of capitalism. You say if the Democratic Party starts to embrace socialism in a purer form, that would be a, quote, big mistake. Do you worry that if the Democratic Party nominates someone, in your view, too far to the left, that will deliver Donald Trump's second term?
I do worry that if we embrace socialism in its pure form, right, that's a mistake, right? I'm a capitalist by nature, but I really do believe in the model that this country has had, right? The genius of our country in many ways, Jake, is that we embraced capitalism. We embraced its power to create jobs and innovate, but we also invested in social programs, right? We did things to moderate capitalism, right? We had regulation, we had tax policy, workers' rights. We built great societal infrastructure to make sure people have a chance. So to some extent, it's a bit of a false choice. We are a capitalist country that has strong social programs, and that's what I think our model is going forward.
Let's get back to the audience. I want to go now to Joseph Jaffe, a marketing consultant from Connecticut. Joseph, aloha.
Hello, and thank you for taking my question. I believe the 2020 general election is going to be a single-issue vote, and that single issue is going to be socialism. Right now, the Democratic legacy is being warped and repositioned as a socialist agenda. So, Congresswoman, my question for you is as follows. How will you counter this perception? Because as they say in marketing, perception is reality. Yeah. And in doing so, restore the democratic ideals to their original truths.
Yeah. It's an important question, and we do this by not falling into this trap of labels that is being set and focusing first and foremost on the people. Right. So you can, and people use all kinds of labels to name this or to name that, and if you pay attention, you'll notice the only reason they're using those labels is to try to pit one group of us against the other, is to try to tear one part of our country away from the other, to divide us as a nation. This goes against the very principles that our founders had for us as a United States of America. And so it's important for this reason and for every other reason why we get into public service to focus first and foremost on serving the people of this country by providing the services and the care, the best care that we can, meeting those needs, working together, bringing the diverse ideas that we have to find that best solution, whether those ideas are coming from Democrats Republicans or independents, taking away all of those barriers and say, how can we best serve? That is our mission, and that's what I'll deliver on as your president.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I understand what you're saying about labels, but that's how we define and understand where people come from ideologically and philosophically. So what about capitalism? Are you a capitalist?
See, here's the thing with all these labels and as you said, how they're used to define people and where they're coming from. But as you see, so many of these labels are misused, misunderstood to the point
so how would you define
where people
yourself?
Don't have any idea what they even mean anymore.
So you're not a capitalist?
I'm an independent-minded person. I'm a Democrat, and my sole focus and purpose is to figure out how we can best serve the people of this country.
Okay.
Let me ask you, in 2000, you first became famous, or at least of note, when you won an essay contest.
I'm not even sure if I'm famous now. Thank you.
We gave you a town hall. You won an essay contest from the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. You wrote an essay about another political figure, Senator Bernie Sanders, now one of your rivals. In your essay, you wrote that Senator Sanders, quote, energy, candor, conviction, and ability to bring people together stand against the current of opportunism, moral compromise, and partisanship, which runs rampant on the American political scene. Do you still feel that way?
In many ways, yes. I really admired when I was, it was 2000, he was an obscure member of Congress, and I was looking for people, as I was tasked with writing this essay on political courage, who just said what they were for. It felt like people had found this way to just outgrow their convictions and say whatever was safe. And he was different, and I respected that, and I still do. Now, it's also the case that I represent a somewhat different message and a very different messenger. But I admire a lot of the other people in this 2020 conversation, and I think the more voices there are in this debate, the better.
Let's turn now to Charles Whatley. He's a digital media executive from El Paso. Mr. Whatley.
Congressman Delaney, thank you for being here. Thank you for running for office. Well, I think most of the people in this room, including myself, believe that it would be a wonderful country to live in with health care provided affordably to everyone. Does the Democratic Party need to get better in touch with the realities of the feasibility and the affordability and the practicality of actually doing so?
Thank you for the question, Charles. And healthcare comes up everywhere I go. I've done over 300 events since I've announced my presidency, and there hasn't been an event, a town hall, a meeting in a coffee shop where healthcare hasn't come up. And I believe healthcare should be a right of every American. Absolutely. It's a basic human right, and I believe it's smart economic policy. I mean, my dad, the union electrician, he had one job for 60 years. Right? Back then, it made sense to have healthcare tied to your job. But I think one of my 4 daughters might have 10 jobs, right? We shouldn't have health care tied to people's jobs. So we need universal health care. But a big theme of my campaign is being honest about the problems and honest about the solutions, right? Having a government-only solution to health care is not the right answer, right? It's not the right answer. Medicaid, which is the largest health care program in this country, only pays about 80% of health care costs. Medicare pays about 95% of health care costs, and private insurance pays about 115% of health care costs. So there's no evidence to suggest that if the government was the only payer of health care, that we'd ever actually pay the cost, and that would result in limited access and limited quality. So I've got a proposal to provide universal health care to every American. It leaves Medicare alone. It creates a new system from when you're born to you're 65. We roll Medicaid into that. You get it as a right of citizenship. But if you don't want it, you can opt out, get a small tax credit, or you can buy a supplemental system. And it's fully paid for by eliminating the corporate deductibility of health care. That's the right solution to the problem we have in health care. It provides everyone with access. It keeps a vibrant private market. It will ensure that Americans have high-quality health care and good access, right? And we can do things to control the cost of health care.
Okay, let's get back to the audience. I want to bring in Ray Ellen Smith, who's an accountant and Democratic activist from New Mexico, who says she's planning to run for office in 2 years. Ray Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question is about Medicare for All, something that intrigues me quite a bit. My question specifically is, what is your position on Medicare for All and the impact it might have to the insurance industry, thousands of jobs being lost, and a potential large segment of our economy vanishing?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for stepping up to run for office when you do. That's an important thing. I support Medicare for All, and I want to tell you why. It is unacceptable that in our country we pay far more for healthcare than any other country in the world, yet we have far worse outcomes than any other country in the world. We have to look at why that is, and we have to understand that in this country, it's unacceptable for anyone to be sick and in need of care and not able to get that care simply because they don't have enough money. So Medicare for all, which we are paying right now with the high cost of healthcare that we are paying, Medicare for all would take out that insurance company that we are writing a big check to every month, and instead we would be able to lower that cost of healthcare by taking out that bloated administrative fees and the heavy profits that insurance companies are making on the backs of sick people in this country, and instead write that check for Medicare for all, where we would have that coverage for everyone. There's a lot of things that we have to look at what are driving the high cost of healthcare. So on its own, Medicare for all is not going to solve everything. We have to address the high cost of prescription drugs. Right now, Medicare today still can't negotiate with prescription drug companies to bring down that cost of healthcare. That has to change. Being able to re-import drugs from places like Canada at a cheaper price is something that we have to be able to do. Focusing on preventive healthcare and trying to make it so that less people are getting sick in the first place is a great investment that we can make in this country. So I believe that we have to come at this from a comprehensive approach, from a holistic approach, as we look to bring down the cost of healthcare and make sure that everyone who needs that care, who wants that care, is able to access it.
Can I just drill down on this just to make sure I'm hearing you right? Do you believe that all private insurance should be eliminated?
I don't. I think Medicare for all, in and of itself, by providing that care, that basic level of care, which would include dental and vision to people, would take away that insurance middleman, that high cost that we are paying right now. If people want to go and get private insurance for something else or something that they're not seeing as being fulfilled, then of course they should have the freedom to do that.
What would that insurance be for? Because, you know, the argument is that if you go that far, then the private insurance markets will bottom out.
Well, the thing is, today, insurance companies are not allowed to offer coverage for things that are already covered by Medicare today. So by expanding Medicare for all, this wouldn't change that. If there are other services or other needs that insurance companies see that they have an opportunity to fill and that people would want, then this is a free country. They'd be able to do that.
I want to bring in Dr. Natasha Demery. She's a physician here in Austin. Dr. Demery.
Thank you for taking my question this evening. As an ER physician, I work on the front lines of America's fractured healthcare system. And whether that's uninsured patients coming to the ER for primary care issues, or it's patients who are sick and insured under Medicare who we can't get timely follow-up for because they're insured under Medicare, the system just seems broken either way. So if you're elected president, what changes do you intend to bring to office and to America's healthcare system to help bring more equitable access to healthcare?
Well, first of all, thanks for what you're doing on the front lines of the medical community. And it's an incredibly important question that I think hangs over our well-being as a country. First of all, we still have uninsured and underinsured people, millions. And it's one of the reasons why we can't be satisfied with where we are. The ACA made a great difference. It made a big difference for members of my own family. But it hasn't gotten us all the way there, and it's vulnerable to being undermined. As a matter of fact, right now, it's under attack by the current administration. That's why I believe we do need to move in the direction of a Medicare for all system. Now, I think anyone in politics who lets the words Medicare for all escape their lips also has a responsibility to explain how we could actually get there. Because as you know, from working on this day in and day out, it's not something you can just flip a switch and do. In my view, the best way to do that is through what you might call a Medicare for all who want it setup. In other words, you take some flavor of Medicare, you make it available on the exchange as a kind of public option, and you invite people to buy into it. So if people like me are right, that that's ultimately going to be more efficient over time and more cost effective, then you will see that very naturally become a glide path. But your question mentioned something else, right? Which is even within Medicare, there are a lot of issues, delays, concerns about whether the rate setting and reimbursement is done in the right way. And so there's also some technical work we've got to do under the hood. You know, we as a country pay out of our healthcare dollar less on patient care and more on bureaucracy than almost any other country in the developed world. And so it's very clear that we've got to do some unglamorous technical work. Actually, some of the benefits of automation could come in this sense. You think about how many hands have to touch a prior authorization sometimes. And the right answer to that should be 0, but we're not there yet. So we've got to do that kind of unfashionable technical work within CMS to make the system more efficient. We've also just got to broaden access to it until everyone has health care. I just refuse to accept that when citizens of just about every developed nation in the world enjoy this, that we should settle for less. And it's become very personal for me, too, because we lost my father a few weeks ago. And it was to cancer. It was a brutally difficult time for our family. I make decisions for a living, and I was not prepared for some of the decisions that we faced in consultation with the medical team. But what I'll say is the decisions that we made only had to be about what was medically right for Dad and what was right for our family. We didn't have to think about whether our family would be financially ruined because of Medicare. And I want that to be available, that kind of security, that kind of freedom, frankly, to be available to every American.
Now let's go to Leanna Galluli from California, who is a drug legalization activist.
Hi.
Aloha.
Thanks for receiving my question.
Thank you.
The opioid epidemic is wreaking havoc across every American, all Americans from every walk of life. Yeah. Addiction or substance use disorder is a public health concern, not a criminal justice concern. I'm wondering if you will end the war on drugs by decriminalizing all drugs and working to remove the stigma, the shame, and the fear that so often prevent people from accessing the help that they need.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for your question, and thanks for your work in this area. You know, in just the last few weeks and having the chance to travel to different parts of the country, we were in New Hampshire, a state that is directly on the front lines and experiencing harshly the results of this opioid epidemic. We had a chance to visit a recovery home and meet with some of the gentlemen who were living there. Men of different ages sharing their stories. One was a college student, one was an engineer, one was an attorney, but each of them sharing how their lives had completely been torn apart and ruined because of this addiction. Not only the addiction itself, but the lawyer was disbarred. The college student was kicked out of school. Some had, I think almost every one of them had spent time in prison. And so I was so impressed with them because of their strength and their resilience. But what they were doing was to try to help other people, to educate them, to lift this stigma and make the point exactly that you're making, that this is about recovery, this is about an addiction, and we need to address that reality and help resolve some of the root causes of why people are turning to different substances in the first place. We must end this failed war on drugs. I introduced legislation just a few days ago in Washington, bipartisan legislation. In fact, the only bipartisan piece of legislation in Congress that would end the federal prohibition on marijuana. This will have a great impact in so many ways on the opioid crisis, where in states where medical marijuana or marijuana as a whole is legalized, we have seen a correlation and a drop in opioid addiction, as well as a drop in opioid-related deaths. This will have an impact on our economy in so many different ways, as well as taking a huge bite out of our broken criminal justice system, where far too many nonviolent drug offenders are wasting away.
So, Congresswoman, you're talking a lot about marijuana, but where do you draw the line on decriminalization? Because one of the questions was about all drugs. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the heart of her question was really recognizing that this is about addiction, not criminalization. Mm-hmm. And so our failed war on drugs has turned everyday Americans who are struggling with substance abuse and addiction and turned them into criminals. At our press conference, we had a guy named Harry who was there from Virginia, who was a college student studying computer science. And, you know, he was not a public speaker. He doesn't do this very often, but he shared his story about how he was in college and he was sent to prison for marijuana possession and had to serve 10 years because of 2 5-year mandatory minimum sentences. He served in, or his cellmate was a guy who was convicted of murder, and he got out of prison before he did. So we have to work towards those steps of completely ending the failed war on drugs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman, you talked earlier about going out and meeting voters and meeting a lot of them who have had to deal with addiction, and especially with the opioid crisis. I want to introduce you to Lynette Pogue. She's an accountant here in Austin. Lynette?
Hi. As a mother of a recovering addict, my family and I would want to know, like, what you would do to expand the national conversation regarding this opioid crisis with practical steps to eliminate or at least decrease this epidemic.
Thank you for the question. It sounds like you've had to deal with a very difficult situation. And I can't tell you how many times I've had questions like this, right? This is just ravaging our country. About 200 people die a day from addictions, over 100 from opioids. It's a public health crisis. It's a public health crisis. And we have to be confronting it as a public health crisis, right? So that's really what we have to do. We have to be confronting it as a public health crisis. We have to be confronting it as a mental health crisis. I think a president's voice should be present in this conversation, but I also think a president has to get some things done, right? There are real programs that work. When I travel around this country and I go to communities, I see nonprofits on the ground that are actually making a difference. So there are people who are fighting this on the front lines. Like police officers, when you talk to members of our terrific law enforcement community, and you talk to them about how their job has changed. And across an evening, 80% of the things they're called in on are overdoses. Right? So it's consuming so many communities. Part of it is because of all the economic despair we have in this country. Huge parts of our country have been left behind economically. 50% of the American people can't afford a $500 expense. Right? Those are the conditions that breed addiction. We haven't treated mental health on parity with physical health. That's part of the problem. We haven't. If I were to ask people in this room, which I won't, to put up your hands if you've had a member of your immediate family that has a mental health issue, I bet every hand would go up. So this is a huge crisis, 40 million Americans, as I said. So we have to address it as a mental health issue, as a public health issue. We have to deal with the pharmaceutical companies, right, that have... Remember how I said to the other gentleman, I think it was Warren, how I talked about how student debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy? Well, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, there was stories last week how they were going to file for bankruptcy to avoid the liability associated with this. Just put it in contrast kind of how our laws are set up in this country. But, it's tearing Americans. It's going to create a huge foster care crisis in this country. It's just tearing our country apart. We have to put resources behind it. We got to be backing things that work. And we have to treat it as the public health and the mental health crisis that it really is. And we have to do things to improve the economic conditions in communities that create the environment for this kind of stuff to happen, because it is a scar on our country right now what's happening. Thank you.
God bless you, Lynette. Thanks for your courage talking about this today. I want to bring in Amber Ivy. She works for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. She previously worked for the state of Maryland. Amber?
Thank you, sir, for taking my question. So as a black woman, one of the things I'm concerned about is that this is a time of year where election season comes around and now all of a sudden people care about the black vote. Who do you plan to partner with to ensure that the agenda for black Americans is not just a part of your stump speech, but it's actually a part of your platform?
Great question. Great question, Amber. So you're from Maryland?
Yes.
Where are you from?
I live in College Park.
Great, great. So I've spent a lot of time while I was in Congress. I spent the last 6 years in Congress working very closely with the Congressional Black Caucus, which I think is not only the conscience of the Congress. I really do think of it that way. The real conscience of the Congress, it's the caucus within the House of Representatives that is really standing up for people every single day. And I've developed terrific relationships with lots of members in the Congressional Black Caucus. And that's one of the places I go when I think about the things we need to do to make sure we don't say equality in this country, but we live it. That's the place I go when I have ideas about how do we actually start not only standing up against kind of brazen and open racism like we saw in Charlottesville, but how do we actually start addressing what I call soft racism, which is kind of the institutions in our society that are fundamentally racially unjust. How do we actually come up with laws around criminal justice and how we fund education to actually make a difference? So your specific question was, where do I go? You know, I had the privilege of serving in the Congress and working so closely with so many of the terrific members in the Congressional Black Caucus. That's kind of where I go, to be honest with you, when I really want to get a check as to whether the ideas that I come up with really make sense for the community.
We're going to get to our next audience question. It comes from Beth Gendler, who is the executive director of the National Council of Jewish Women in Minnesota and also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman. As a co-founder of the Muslim and Jewish Women of Minnesota Policy Collaborative, I'm troubled by the increase in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that's infecting discourse on both sides of the political aisle. Regardless of where it comes from, it puts both of our communities in real danger. As president, what can you do in terms of policy and position to combat racism and bigotry no matter where it comes from?
Thank you. Thank you, Beth, and thank you for your leadership in this area. And this is so important. We see incidents occurring far too often where there is not only hateful words and bigotry, but actual violence being used against people because of the color of our skin or the way that we choose to worship. As a practicing Hindu, I have been on the receiving end of Hindu phobia and bigoted attacks. The very first time that I ran for Congress in 2012, my Republican opponent at that time said on television that I was not qualified to serve in Congress because my being a Hindu contradicted the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, even now, as I stand before you here today and running for president, those Hindu-phobic attacks continue. Attacks against Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, people of all different religions cannot be allowed to stand. And what is most important is to lead from the front. Yes, as President of the United States, I will do that in calling out and condemning those bigoted attacks. But this is something that each and every one of us has the opportunity to do when we are confronted with such bigotry. It is only when we stand together and speak out against and condemn this kind of bigotry and the violent acts that sometimes occur as a result that we can actually change, make that real change we know we need to see.
And Congresswoman, if you want to sit, I just want to ask you a follow-up question on this very topic, because you voted this past week to condemn anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. And this vote, of course, came after your fellow Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar suggested that support for Israel in Congress is, quote, all about the Benjamins, and criticized lawmakers just this past week for supporting Israel as potentially having, quote, allegiance to a foreign country. What do you think about these statements, and do you think this is anti-Semitic?
Well, let's look at the bigger issue here. The bigger issue is, there's a couple actually, of making sure that as members of Congress and as people in this country, we can have open dialogue about our foreign policy. You know, as there are criticisms levied about dual loyalty. Again, as I mentioned in the last question, I've been on the receiving end of those types of attacks, so I can understand how offensive they can be. Where just because I am a Hindu, people assume that therefore I must be loyal to some other interest or some other place.
But what about these specific statements? You're talking broadly. These specific statements, were they anti-Semitic?
There are people who have expressed their offense at these statements. I think that what Congresswoman Omar was trying to get at was a deeper issue related to our foreign policy. And I think there's an important discussion that we have to be able to have openly, even though we may end up disagreeing at the end of it, that we've got to be able to have that openness to have the conversation.
But you're not willing to go as far as saying it's anti-Semitic.
What I'm saying is what she was trying to bring up was something that was a deeper issue. Okay. And I don't believe that her intent was to cause any offense to anyone.
I want to keep on this topic and bring in James Doty, who's a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford. Professor?
Hi. Thank you for your service and your position in politics. The question I'd like to ask you is, as you pointed out, Vice President Pence is obviously quite conservative. And in regard to these conservative views, in regard to religion and his sexuality, in comparison to the average voter or the voter in Indiana, let's say, are his views an aberration, or is this really representative of the state? Or are most people more like you in your more liberal views about us as humans?
Please don't judge my state by our former governor. I think those views are so out of line with where anybody is. And look, I got to tell you, this was kind of a difficult journey for a lot of people. I mean, if you were conservative and you're from an older generation and you were brought up by people you trusted to believe that it was morally wrong to be, for example, in a same-sex marriage, and then the pace of change has happened so quickly, I've benefited from the pace of that change. But I also understand how disorienting it must be for people to have gone through that. So when we had this huge and painful controversy in 2015, when Mike Pence divided our state with this so-called Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was really a license to discriminate, provided you remembered to mention your religion as an excuse for discriminating. That's what that was. When that happened, we worked really hard to invite people who were struggling to come onto the right side of history but wanted to get there, to feel that we weren't going to judge them because they had struggled. We just wanted them on our side. But the amazing thing that happened in Indiana was that Democrats and Republicans rose up. There was a coalition of mayors, business leaders, sports leaders. I think even NASCAR put out a statement saying they were disappointed. And the business Republicans in our state revolted right alongside us progressives. And so that shows me that there is a belief in just decency that really does stand against that kind of social extremism. And my hope is that same decency can be summoned from our communities in red states and blue states to change what's happening in the politics of our country before it's too late.
Do you think Vice President Pence would be a better or worse president than President Trump?
Oh. Does it have to be between
Politics is about choices, man. You know that.
I mean, I don't know. It's really strange because I used to at least believe that he believed in our... I've disagreed with him ferociously on these things, but I thought, well, at least he believes in our institutions and he's not personally corrupt. But then how could he get on board with this presidency? How could somebody who, you know, his interpretation of Scripture is pretty different from mine to begin with. Okay, my understanding of Scripture is that it is about protecting the stranger and the prisoner and the poor person and that idea of welcome. That's what I get in the gospel when I'm in church. And his has a lot more to do with sexuality and, I don't know, a certain view of rectitude. But even if you buy into that, how could he allow himself to become the cheerleader of the porn star presidency? Is it that he stopped believing in Scripture when he started believing in Donald Trump? I don't know. I don't know.
Thank you. Let's get back to the audience. The next question comes from Seth Tiven, a musician and software engineer right here in Austin.
Thank you. Can you convince me that your prior positions on gay rights have truly changed? I'm especially concerned about your previous support of conversion therapy, which I find really, really repulsive. And I'd like to understand what caused you to reevaluate your positions and change them.
Thank you for your question. I want to correct the record on something that's very important that you raised. I personally never supported any kind of conversion therapy. I never advocated for conversion therapy. And frankly, I didn't even know what conversion therapy was until just the last few years. I think it was when I was first running for Congress when someone was asking me about it. I was raised in a very socially conservative home. My father is Catholic. He was a leading voice against gay marriage in Hawaii during that time. Again, I was very young, but these were the values and the beliefs that I grew up around. my own personal journey as I went out in different experiences in my life, especially going and deploying to the Middle East, where I saw firsthand the negative impact of a government attempting to act as a moral arbiter for their people, dictating in the most personal ways how they must live their lives. And so it caused me to confront that contradiction, where as a soldier standing for freedom for all people here in this country, but also how that contradicted with some of those values and beliefs that I grew up with. I also served with gay and lesbian and trans service members, and we became very good friends and knew in the most deep and visceral way that I would give my life for any one of them. And I knew that they would do the same for me. And serving there overseas, being in a place where race or religion or orientation, these were things that didn't matter because we were focused on our mission of service. So these experiences caused me to go through some soul searching myself. And so I ask you to look to my record in Congress now for over 6 years, where it is a reflection of what is in my heart, and it's a reflection of my commitment to fight for equality for all people. I have a 100% legislative rating from the Human Rights Campaign that reflects on a whole variety of issues and pieces of legislation how I have carried through on that commitment, which will continue as President and Commander-in-Chief.
Congressman, thank you. You've talked a great deal about the need for bipartisan legislation to combat climate change. On that topic, I want to bring in Brett Jenks. He runs a global conservation organization in Virginia. He says he and his wife live in a green home. Brett?
Thank you for taking my question. Regarding climate change, personal behavior is a pretty good indicator of one's values and attitudes. And I just wonder, over the last 12 months, what have you and your family done to reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions?
You know, it's a terrific question, because if we all did something, right? I remember President Obama he was serious about what we should do with the air in the tires, right? And he was mocked for that, but he was actually right? Because if everyone did that, how much it would reduce our footprint. I mean, my wife and I and our 4 daughters, we spend a lot of time talking about what we can do specifically to reduce our environmental footprint, installing energy efficient systems in our homes, right? Trying to be as efficient as possible with just how we live our day-to-day lives, having renewables as part of our home energy strategy. So, you know, we try to kind of walk the talk, which is what you're getting at. But we also have to, you know, we also, as a leader, we have to put forth policies. I mean, I think climate change is one of the great threats to the next generation of Americans. And we have to stop talking about it. We have to start doing things, which is one of the reasons I introduced the only bipartisan carbon tax bill in the Congress. Puts a price on carbon. All the revenues get collected, get given back to the American people in the form of a dividend, right? And it's bipartisan. It's one of the reasons I've called for a 5-fold increase in the Department of Energy research budget. Because the American way in solving problems is through innovation, right? And we need more innovation around storage and transmission. It's one of the reasons I'm working on unique ideas to fund negative emissions technologies, which I think have to be incredibly important to how we get out of this climate dilemma. These are machines that actually take carbon out of the atmosphere, and they exist. The problem is they're really expensive. So we need to create a market for them. And if we can do that, it can not only help get the United States to where I believe we need to be, which is net zero by 2050, but we can also have the technology that can save the world. So we try to walk the talk. My wife April and I, who's right here in the front row with me, we try to walk the talk in our family, but I also, you know, importantly, want to be a leader on this, and I want to get something done right away, because we need to act on climate immediately.
So let me ask you just a follow-up, if I could. You've slammed the Green New Deal as, quote, about as realistic as Trump saying that Mexico is going to pay for the wall. What do you say to supporters of the proposal who say this is a time for bold solutions to address this crisis?
It is a time for bold solutions, but we also have to put our shoulder behind things that can actually get done. Because climate, Jake, is not like other issues, right? We have an infrastructure issue in this country. But if we wait 5 years to deal with our infrastructure, it's a missed opportunity, but it doesn't get exponentially worse. So we have to deal with climate change right away. Right? So what I'll do in my first year as president is get a bipartisan carbon tax bill passed in the Congress. That we can get done. That will reduce carbon emissions by 90%. Then what we have to do, as I said to the gentleman, put energy behind innovation and new strategies. We have to have a goal around climate that's realistic. We shouldn't be tying action on climate to universal health care, which I support, don't get me wrong, right? Or we shouldn't be tying action around climate to something like universal basic income, right, which I actually don't support, right? If we actually think climate change is the existential issue of our time, then what we need to be doing is focusing on that and getting something done right away.
The next question.
I want to go again to the audience. Our next question comes from Paul Hinkey, a software developer from Los Angeles.
Aloha, Paul.
Hi. We, as a people, have really benefited greatly from the capacity of science to make predictions about an unknown future. Climate science predicts that this century we will suffer catastrophic consequences of accelerating global warming. Yet the government's response has been to turn a blind eye. Why does this issue not have more political traction, and with what urgency will you address it if you are elected president?
Yeah, thank you. You know, before I ran for Congress, I served on our Honolulu City Council, a district that is one of the largest city councils in the country, represented close to 100,000 people. And one of the things that we went through in our deliberations and bringing in experts and meeting with planners, city planners, was the impact of climate change on our home as an island state. This wasn't some far-off theory or some possibility in the next generation that people might have to face. This was in the next 10, 15, 20 years, how much are the sea levels going to rise that are going to start taking over our communities? And we're seeing this now. There was just a resolution passed in Hawaii calling for an emergency because homes and roads are being eroded because of these rising sea levels in the ocean. So we know how urgent this is, as do many people in this country. I think there are a number of reasons we can look to why Washington hasn't taken this more seriously, and I think one of the big ones is the big influence of money in politics, as well as industries like the fossil fuel industry continue. You have high-powered lobbyists who try to block and get in the way of real legislation being passed. But this is something that will require us as people to stand up and make sure that our voices are heard to the leaders of this country to understand the seriousness of this threat and how bold action must be taken to protect us, to protect our home and our planet and our future. Yes, there are things that we can do in our everyday lives to try to make this change, but this really needs to happen at the national level, and it needs to happen at the global level. Even if we made the kind of change we need to see, the radical change we want to see here in this country to completely get off of fossil fuels and invest in green economy and sustainable infrastructure and make the kinds of changes we want to see, that still will not have enough of an impact unless we are seeing these kinds of changes also being made in other countries in the world. This is why it's so important that we have relationships with these other countries that are based on cooperation so that we can talk about how we can protect our environment, how we can protect our future. If we can't have those conversations, then there's no possibility for progress there.
Joe Silver. Sorry, Joe Silver's from New York. He works with clean energy startups. Joe?
Yes. Good evening, Mayor.
Good evening, Joe.
I know, and most Americans know, that climate change is an existential crisis facing this planet. How will you move the debate and conversation forward in D.C., in Washington, to focus on realistically dealing with this challenge and implementing solutions to prevent catastrophic future impacts to climate change and mitigating the current impacts that we're dealing with today?
Thank you. So we've got to do two things. One, change the way we talk about the problem, And then 2, change our level of commitment when it comes to the solution. The way we talk about the problem, I think even now, is often in theoretical terms. If you close your eyes and think of the cable news, forgive me, but the cable news B-roll that usually comes up when there's a story on climate change, it's probably going to be some hunk of ice breaking off the Antarctic, right? But the imagery that plays in my mind when the question of climate change comes up is a family on Frederickson Street in South Bend. Because I found myself there the day before school started, trying to help a family figure out what they were going to do, having been run out of their house by a catastrophic flood. We've had 2 floods in the city of South Bend. One called I believe it was a 1,000-year rainfall, and the other was a 500-year flood. They were 18 months apart. So the time has ended for us to debate whether it's happening and to take it seriously, but not as something that's happening somewhere in the Arctic or even just on the coasts. It is happening in our communities, in the heart of America today. Not to mention parts of California catching on fire. And my fellow mayors, when I meet them from Florida, worried about sea level rise that's happening right now. We've got to treat this like the emergency that it is, and we've also got to treat it as a security issue, because we need our expectations of 21st century security to include the concept of climate security. Now, you would think that it would just be table stakes to acknowledge that it's a problem, but we're in a place where you got to do that. Now, what are we going to do about it? It's not like it's going to be easy. To some extent, we're already in adaptation mode no matter what because of the warming that's already occurred, and we'll be unstoppable. But we've got to make sure that we are reducing carbon levels at least to the kinds of commitments that were in the Paris Accord, which we should rejoin immediately when the new president takes office. More investments in renewables are going to be needed. We're going to have to contemplate a carbon tax. And by the way, there are ways to do it that most Americans would be better off fiscally because we could return it right back to the American people. But in so doing, would help capture the true cost of things that are happening right now, because it's in your and my lifetime that that cost is going to be paid one way or the other.
Thanks for your question. I want to bring in Jacqueline Lavorgna. She works as a strategist for Southern New Hampshire University. Jacqueline.
Good evening, Congressman.
Hey, Jacqueline.
Thank you for taking my question.
Thank you for asking it.
I was wondering, how will you prepare the American people for imminent displacement and job disruption resulting from advances in artificial intelligence and automation technology?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because to some extent, this is actually the most important thing for us to be talking about. People think by 2030, 50 million jobs in our country could be displaced or fundamentally changed because of artificial intelligence and automation. So I've called for a national artificial intelligence strategy. I founded the AI caucus in the Congress, and I've called for this country to have a strategy, right? Other countries have it. Germany has one. The EU has one. China absolutely has one, trust me. We don't have one. It should have 4 components to it. It should be focused on work, which is what you're getting at. How do we make sure people have the skills? How do we make sure there's jobs in the future? Where I think there will be, right? But we have to make sure they're everywhere and in all communities. You know, last year, 80% of the venture capital in the United States of America was invested in 50 counties out of 3,100 counties. Think about that, right? We have to make sure technology jobs and these kind of things are happening everywhere. So our national AI strategy should focus on work. It should focus on national security, because that's really our threats going forward. It should focus on privacy, right? My wife is the Washington director for Common Sense Media, which does a lot of work on digital privacy, and it's a big issue. And it should also focus on programming bias, meaning the machines that people are coming up with now, these miraculous machines, they're going to make all the decisions that human beings have historically made. And we've had a hard time getting the bias out of our human-based society. I worry it's going to be programmed into all the machines. But your issue, which is the future of work, is a very big issue for me. I think there will be a lot of jobs in the future. I just want to make sure everyone can get them, and they're located everywhere in this country. So thank you.
The next question comes from Anjali Parorthar, a business manager from Seattle. Anjali.
Thank you for this opportunity. You have very effectively pinpointed job automation as a key pivot in our near future. And your understanding of the psychological implications of losing your work identity are on point. But how do you tactically propose we avert an unemployment crisis? And how will you shepherd our country's people through this change?
Well, thanks for the question. It's so important. As you know, automation is transforming our economy, and we can't pretend that it can just be stopped or reversed. I think part of the core falsehood of the current White House and the campaign that got us here was the idea that we could somehow turn back the clock. I don't think you can ever have an honest politics that revolves around the word again. So it's not about stopping or reversing technology. It is about making sure that the tectonic social and economic changes that it could drive are changes that can actually work for us, because the pace of change is only going to accelerate. So you mentioned the word tactical, and some of these things are very technical and near to the ground. Making sure, for example, that the United States is keeping pace with our competitors like China when it comes to the investments we're making in AI and automation, so that when those leaps and bounds are made, hopefully they're made in and by our country. But it also rises, I think, to a higher level, which is how do we make sure that when those job transitions happen, and there's just going to be more of them, our generation is likely to change careers more frequently than our parents changed job titles. And what we've got to do in that environment is make it less of a disruptive event in your entire life when those changes occur. It's why we need portable benefits. It's why the conversation about Medicare for all is so important. It's why we might even need to look at guaranteed income for working people as a policy that will help smooth the edges of that. And then at the highest level, we've got to pay attention to the fact that when somebody loses their job or is transitioning jobs, what's at stake isn't just their income, it's their identity. And I think we don't always recognize that you get community, purpose, and identity from the workplace. And yet we can no longer count on a lifelong relationship with a single employer as a source of community and identity and purpose in the same way. That's okay as long as we have other things to replace that lost sense of identity. And I think there's some very good answers for that. As a mayor, I see it happening a lot in terms of community itself. People who go through all kinds of jobs, but I know exactly where they fit in the community, and that is stable. It could also come from answers that are traditionally thought of as more conservative, like faith and like family. But the most important thing is that we build up answers for that, because if we don't, some very negative and very ugly things, from substance abuse to the worst kind of white identity politics that I think we were served up in 2016, could rush in to fill the void.
Let me just follow up if I can. What do you mean by a guaranteed income?
Well, again, we're at the outset of learning about what these policies could do on the ground. For example, there's an experiment going on right now in the city of Stockton with what's called universal basic income, where they're actually simply distributing payments to people to make sure that that income floor is lifted. The idea is there are too many Americans who couldn't find even $400 in an emergency to get them through that. Now, I'm not yet sure that we know that that's the right way to go, but I do think it's the sort of bold policy we should contemplate, especially if we can construct it in a way that it's connected to work. But maybe we ought to broaden our definition of work. So, for example, if you are taking care of a parent or raising a child, isn't that work? And shouldn't we honor that too?
I want to bring in Maggie Curry from California. She works in marketing at a winery. Maggie.
I do, yeah. Good evening.
Good evening.
So I'm a married working mom of two, and living in California, our family is faced with the double income need. So I'm wondering how your platform will address that struggle.
Could you ask the question a little more specifically?
I'm a married working mom
Yeah.
of two kids, and in California, it's almost mandatory that we have two incomes to support the family.
Because of the cost of living.
Cost of living of housing,
Yeah.
either rent or own.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you can do with your platform to help ease that struggle.
So one of the things I've called for, and thank you for asking the question, and I hope you're having a good time down here in Austin. One of the things I've called for is doubling of something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I think is one of the most successful tax programs we have in this country. And as you may know, this is a tax credit that goes in the pocket of working families. You have to work to get it, but it's designed for hard-working families. And instead of kind of doing the tax cuts that the Republicans just did and Trump just did in the Congress, which were focused on cutting tax rates of corporations, we should have done something like double the Earned Income Tax Credit. Because that would help the people who need the help. That would help hardworking families by putting money in their pockets and making it easier to live, because you live in a really high-cost area. And it's really hard. I mean, we have an affordable housing crisis in this country. And I'm sure you know, based on where you live, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's another thing we need to do is we need to put more resources behind affordable housing. I introduced a bipartisan affordable housing bill as part of comprehensive housing finance reform that would put about another $6 billion, it was bipartisan, put another $6 billion out in the communities for affordable housing. So I think things like making housing more affordable, creating kind of a universal health care system, doubling the earned income tax credit, right? That's an agenda for working families. That's the kind of agenda that will make your life easier. That's the kind of agenda that's not focused on tax cuts for high earners or corporations. I mean, the thing about the corporate tax cut, you know, the corporate tax rate in this country was 35%. President Obama wanted to lower it to 27 or 28% to make it more competitive. The business community asked for 25%. They would come to the Congress and lobby for 25%. President Trump cut it to 21%. No one even asked for that. I mean, talk about a bad negotiator. I mean, he gave them, they didn't even ask for 21%. The difference between 27, which is what President Obama wanted, and 21, it's about $700 billion. That would have gone a long way to increase the earned income tax credit. That's smart tax policy that's focused on the needs of the American people.
Thank you. On the topic of foreign affairs, let me bring in Alexandra Barrienta. She's a tech recruiter who lives in the Austin area. Alexandra?
Hi. My question is, all the national security agencies are in agreement that the U.S. was targeted by the Russians seeking to shake up the 2016 election. So what is your plan for defending the United States against another attack like that?
It's a great question. You're right. All 17 national security agencies in the United States of America, all 17 of them, are in unanimous agreement that Russia intentionally interfered in our elections. So I believe them over Putin. So I'll start with that. So our elections are in many ways the most sacred thing in our democracy. So we need to be hardening our election systems in this country to make sure they're safe from foreign interference. And this president hasn't done enough in that, and I will. But I also think you have to deal with Russia, and they have to understand that they can't do this. Right? So that would be my approach, right? I wouldn't believe Vladimir Putin just because he said he didn't do it, which is what the current president is doing. I would believe our intelligence agencies. I would make it clear to Russia that we have a zero-tolerance policy as it relates to them interfering in our election. But I would also make sure that our systems are hardened, right, that they're hardened against cyber attacks generally, but against this attack specifically, because it gets to the core functioning of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's say aloha to everybody in the audience, and we want to talk to the voters. And let's start with Cynthia Machada, who is from Connecticut. She works in marketing and communications.
Hi, Congressman. My question for you tonight is about anti-interventionist. So you've been known for being anti-interventionist, which is the U.S. not going into wars that are backing anti-regime or regime change. But yet you do fight in the military, and thank you for your service. But my question for you is, how can you be both an anti-interventionist and also serve in the military?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this important question that is personal to me, but is important to all of us as Americans. I'm a soldier. I have served now in the Army National Guard now for nearly 15 years. I'm a major, and I've deployed twice to the Middle East. In Congress, I've served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, in the Armed Services Committee, Homeland Securities Committees now for over the last 6 years, so have a very personal understanding as well as an understanding from Washington about the cost of war and who pays the price. During my first deployment to Iraq, I served in a medical unit where my very first task every single day was to go through a list of names of every single American service member who had been injured in combat the day before. This was the first thing I did every day for the year that I was deployed. And every day, seeing in such a heart-wrenching way who pays the price. And my brothers and sisters who never made that trip home, who paid that ultimate price. And those who did, coming home with wounds, both visible and invisible, that they would continue to struggle with for years after. My position and my commitment in fighting to end these counterproductive regime change wars is based on these experiences and my understanding the cost of war and who pays the price. Yes, it is our service members. It is our troops. It is our military families. It is the people in these countries where these wars are waged whose suffering ends up far worse after we launch these regime change wars. But it is also every single one of us here. Every single American is paying for these wars through our taxpayer dollars, trillions of our taxpayer dollars being spent, dollars that should be used to invest in and to meet the needs and serve the needs of people here at home, to pay for things like healthcare and education, to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. So as a soldier, I stand ready to serve and protect and defend this country. And as a soldier, I know the cost of war. And as president and commander-in-chief, I will end these regime change wars. I will work to end this new Cold War and this nuclear arms race that is costing us trillions. And again, take those resources, those limited resources, and use them to serve the needs of people here.
Which wars would you end when you're talking? I mean, that's a lot that you just laid out there.
It is a lot, but this is the threat that we're facing. Regime change wars that we are seeing still being carried out in Syria. Regime change wars that this current administration is threatening to carry out in countries like Venezuela, laying down the groundwork to carry out a regime change war in Iran. We see throughout decades how this policy has persisted through both Democrat and Republican administrations and the negative impact that these wars have caused.
You would be the first veteran of the war in Afghanistan to serve as a president of the United States. The Trump administration is reportedly planning to withdraw about half of the 14,000 U.S. service members in Afghanistan. Do you agree with that approach? As president, how many troops would you keep in Afghanistan?
Yeah, we have got to put an end to endless war. You could be old enough. You could be old enough to enlist and have not even been alive now when 9/11 happened. I was in that war 5 years ago, and at the time, then they told us that it was ending, and it's still going on. Now, there may need to be some residual intelligence or special operations capability to make sure that there is never an attack launched against the United States as a consequence of what's going on there. I'm encouraged to see the peace talks that are taking place in Doha. If the Taliban are really serious about being ready to lay down their arms, that's a good sign. But, I'm also a little concerned that the Afghan government seems to be an afterthought in this process because the peace needs to be sustainable. At the end of the day, we can't be the guarantors of peace and stability in Afghanistan.
So you pointed out that you, if elected president, would have the most military experience of a commander-in-chief since George H.W. Bush, who fought in World War II. Barack Obama didn't have any military experience. Does it matter? Do you think it's an important part of it's certainly an important part of your biography, and we honor it, but does it matter as a part of your resume for president that you serve?
I think so. I don't mean to say that you have to have served in the military to be eligible to run, but I do think that it brings a lot of perspective. First of all, again, you can never lose touch with why politics matters, with why it matters who's sitting on that desk. I mean, when you have had the experience of taking a letter, writing a letter, and then putting it in an envelope, marked just in case, and putting it where you know your family can find it, and packing your bags and leaving, you have a sense of the gravity and the weight of the decisions that are made in the White House. But there's something else about serving that I think the generation of George H.W. Bush and JFK experienced, which is that it brings you together with other Americans. I mean, when I got into the vehicle, a big part of my job was just driving and guarding vehicles on movements around Kabul or occasionally between Kabul and Bagram. And, when somebody got in my vehicle, they didn't care whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. They didn't care if I was going home to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They wanted to know if I was doing my job well and if I could keep them safe. And we learned to trust each other with our lives, even though our politics and our lives back home are so different. And I think we need to get back to that. It shouldn't require going to war to get that. But one reason I'm a big believer in expanding opportunities for national service is that we need more common experiences in this world that's divvied up into Twitter sphere bubbles and ideological echo chambers. We need more of those experiences that can bring us together, even when we have nothing in common except the fact that we're American.
The next question comes from Ariel Smith. She's from Houston. She works at an energy technology company.
Hi, thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
Having grown up in one of the most diverse cities in the country, I understand both the threat and opportunity that illegal immigrants have brought to my community. I firmly believe that if there wasn't a market for the illegal immigrants to bring in, so by the way of drugs, labor, trafficking, that we could dramatically reduce the problem that we see at the border currently.
Right.
What would you suggest that we could do to domestically to combat the markets that make illegal immigration so lucrative?
Well, it's a terrific question, and I've spent a bunch of time at the border in the last year. I went down to Brownsville and McAllen to look at some of the economic issues associated with what's going on the border. And my wife and I went down about 2 months ago. We took 14 law students to Dilley, Texas, where the largest detention facility exists in this country, to help people seeking asylum make their case. So, I've tried to really spend time really seeing what's going on the border. We got to reduce the market for drugs in this country. And we all know what we're doing now doesn't work, right? Having these things being sold in the shadows, et cetera, which is why in many ways there's such a movement at the state level to legalize marijuana, to decriminalize it, and at a minimum to allow it to be legal for medical purposes. And I think the federal government should get out of the way and let that movement continue. Because right now the federal government is blocking it by keeping marijuana as a scheduled substance, right? And I think that's preventing the states from doing really what they want to do. So I'm in favor of that, which would basically get marijuana out of the shadows and get it into a market where it could be regulated, where we can make sure it's labeled and distributed appropriately, where we can tax it. So that's one of the things we need to do. But as we all know, there's a lot of other drugs that are coming into this country, and we have a huge addiction crisis in this country. We have to invest in technology at the port of entries, which is where 90% of this stuff comes in. So that's another solution I would do. Thank you.
Congresswoman, you mentioned Syria. We actually have a question on that. I want to bring in Jessica James, a consultant from New Jersey.
Thank you. Do you remain skeptical, as you were in 2017, that Bashar al-Assad used chemical warfare against Syrian civilians?
I want to correct that because there's been some misunderstanding. There have been reports showing that chemical weapons have been used in Syria, both by the Syrian government as well as different terrorist groups on the ground in Syria. The skepticism and the questions that I raised were very specific around incidents that the Trump administration was trying to use as an excuse to launch a U.S. military attack in Syria. Now, I served in a war in Iraq, a war that was launched based on lies, and a war that was launched without evidence. And so the American people were duped. So as a soldier, as an American, as a member of Congress, it is my duty and my responsibility to exercise skepticism anytime anyone tries to send our service members into harm's way or use our military to go in and start a new war.
May I just ask a follow-up about that? Because, Congresswoman, the Defense Department, the United Nations agree that the Assad regime used chemical weapons against its own people. So, as president, would you trust the conclusions of your government?
Well, like I said, we have in our recent past a situation where our own government told lies to the American people and to the United Nations, for that matter, to launch a war. So what I'm saying is it is our responsibility to exercise due diligence, to ask the tough questions, to get the evidence before we make those very costly decisions about how and when and where our military is used.
While we're on the topic of Syria, this week, Syrian refugees in Jordan, they requested that the first international criminal court case against the Syrian government commence. You met Bashar al-Assad in 2017. Do you believe that Assad is a war criminal?
I think that the evidence needs to be gathered. And as I have said before, if there is evidence that he has committed war crimes, he should be prosecuted as such.
But you're not sure now?
Everything that I have said requires that we take action based on evidence. The evidence is there. There should be accountability.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to bring in Gretchen Bella. She's a senior at the University of Texas at Austin. Gretchen.
Thank you for having me. Lieutenant, as a veteran of Afghanistan, what's your take on the situation in Venezuela right now? And if you were in office, how would you respond to this crisis?
Well, the situation in Venezuela is highly disturbing, and I think that the Maduro regime has lost its legitimacy. That's why it's not just the U.S., but 50 countries that have declined to recognize the legitimacy of that regime. That being said, that doesn't mean that we just carelessly threaten the use of military force, which is what it appeared the National Security Advisor was doing at one point, kind of hinting that troops might be sent to South America. First of all, I don't understand how somebody who was involved in leading us into the Iraq War is allowed that near to the Situation Room to begin with. But I don't mean to disagree that we need to support democratic outcomes in that country. And so to the extent that sanctions can be targeted and can be focused on trying to bring about new, free, and fair elections so that there can be self-determination by the Venezuelan people that puts in a government that I think has that legitimacy, then we should do our part, not through force, but through the diplomatic toolkit in order to try to bring that outcome about.
I want to go now. Our next question comes from Joy Craig, a retired U.S. Marine officer who fights against sexual assault in the military.
Thank you very much. Aloha,
Thank you for your
Congresswoman.
service.
Thank you for yours. As one woman officer to another, I'd like to know what you would like to do to stop sexual assault in the military. And as Commander-in-Chief, will you commit to signing the Military Justice Improvement Act should it come across your desk?
Yes. Thank you. I led the introduction of the Military and Justice Improvement Act in the House of Representatives, so absolutely I would sign it into law as your President and Commander-in-Chief. As a fellow service member, we have lived through experiences ourselves and things that our fellow brothers and sisters in uniform have gone through. I have sat through hearings and engaged with leaders from the Department of Defense in my role as a member of the Armed Services Committee, where unfortunately there is a lack of recognition of the serious change that needs to take place for there to be a true path for justice for victims of sexual assault in the military. I believe that we still today don't know how rampant sexual assault in the military is, because there is still a fear of retaliation, there is a stigma, and people who don't want to be known as that one. She or he is that one who went against the team, who turned their back. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And we know people ourselves who have gone through this and felt like they had no place to turn. So this legislation is so important because it provides that path outside of the chain of command where you know that there is no one, whether it's your team leader, platoon leader, or your first sergeant, or your commander, there is no one who will be able to stop your pursuit of justice and accountability if you're a victim of assault in the military. This is such an important issue. Thank you for raising it. It's one that I'm going to continue to fight for. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you another question about this, because I'm sure you saw Republican Senator Martha McSally this week reveal during a hearing that she was raped while she was serving in the military. You talked about your experience in hearings, but you've actually served in combat zones. From your experience, how prevalent is this?
You know, the data and the studies can't be accurate. And this is the problem, because for women, and it's even more so amongst men who have come forward, who feel like it's impossible. They can't tell their story.
And did you have people who you served with who felt that way, who
absolutely
confided in you?
Absolutely. People who we, as their friends, strongly urge them, you have to report this, you have to take action, if not for yourself, then for someone else, because this person will continue to perpetrate this violence and this assault on other people. But I'll tell you, one of my closest friends still refused to do it.
Still to this day.
Still to this day. She has never reported what happened to her. And it's unless you've gone through it yourself, it's hard to understand fully all of the fears and the concerns that some of my friends have shared with me that have stopped them from coming forward. The kinds of attacks, the kinds of assumptions that are made against people who do, and the kind of stigma that ends up hanging over their shoulders where, hey, maybe they were Soldier of the Year and they were great at their job and they accomplished their mission, but now all of a sudden, all of that falls away because they come forward and this is what they're known for. So yes, we have to pass legislation. We have to change our laws to make sure that this accountability is there and that this independent, transparent path towards justice exists. But it's a bigger challenge that we've got to face as a country that not only impacts the military, but it impacts our college campuses. It impacts us in the workplace, in every part of our society where it is still not a safe place to be able to come forward if you're a victim of these kinds of attacks and know that change will happen.
Thank you for that.
I want to bring in Alicia Filiolo. She is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran who is married to a member of the U.S. Air Force. She lives in the San Antonio area. Alicia.
Sir, Mayor Pete, as a veteran, you understand the hardship service members encounter upon leaving active duty and the strain that it can place on their families when leaving. If elected, what initiatives do you plan on creating that will ensure that our nation's most selfless men and women will be able to effectively leave service and transition into civilian life without needing to apply for social services and state aid?
Well, first of all, thank you for your service, for your spouse's service. Anyone who is married to a member of the military is also serving. So when both of you are both a military member and a military spouse, it's an incredible gift to the country, and I want to honor that and thank you for it. As you know, coming back is a challenge. Leaving active duty is a challenge, and coming back from a deployment is a challenge. Even I, with the great day job to come back to and the best possible community support, felt the disorientation and the challenge of coming back. And as you say, or as I think I understood in your question, it's not just a matter of making sure that the minimum kind of social services are available for somebody who can't find anywhere else to go. It's about making sure that that reintegration takes place, not just through things like, obviously, the VA and other entities that are designed to make sure that we keep that mutual promise with our service members, but also something that I think goes a little wider than that, which is recognizing that service members who return want not so much to be given things as to be able to continue to give. And again, that sense of community, identity, and purpose that we were talking about from the workplace, there's no workplace that gives you that better than the military, in my view. In South Bend, we've piloted an initiative, we were one of the first cities to do it, called Vets Community Connections. And the idea was not another website, not another program, but actually enlisting, so to speak, anybody in the community who wanted to say a little more than just thank you for your service, to help people who are coming off active duty or coming off a deployment navigate their way around a community and really embrace them. Even at the most basic things of helping them not only find a job, but find a trombone lesson for their kid or find their way around these new communities. Because I believe the way we think about veterans shouldn't be as a problem to be solved, but frankly as a class of people to be competed over. I think about the gunny sergeant who was my right-hand man when I was in Afghanistan, about to retire at the tender age of 40 or so after active duty. And when he and Mrs. Gunny and their 4 kids are looking for a place that will support them and welcome them as he thinks about getting another degree and starting the second part of his career, I want South Bend to be a community of choice. I think the federal policy should be to support communities in doing that and find other ways to enlist ordinary Americans in going above and beyond merely saying thank you for your service.
I want to get straight to the audience for another question. John Cook, management consultant from right here in Austin.
Thanks for having us in your town.
Welcome to Austin.
Thank you.
Y'all. Okay. So moving away from policy for a second, an important consideration for me is, can you beat Donald Trump? So my question to you is, so what would be your strategy in a debate with someone who seems to make up any answer that's convenient or expedient and will not acknowledge reality?
Good question. As a soldier, I've been through some tough situations before. So I'm not really worried about Donald Trump. I'm focused on serving the people of this country, on bringing those values of service above self that every service member has in our hearts to the White House, and restoring to the presidency honor and integrity and courage. Thank you.
Susan Kenyon is a retired attorney from Massachusetts. Susan? Hi.
Hi, Mayor Pete. Do you believe that Congress should begin impeachment proceedings against President Trump?
I would like to see this president and the style of politics that he represents sent off through the electoral process, decisively defeated at the ballot box. Because I just don't think that's what America is. I understand how it happened. Believe me, I come from the industrial Midwest. There are a lot of people who voted for him and also voted for me, and also voted for Barack Obama. So these things are complicated, but part of how it happened was a lot of people felt that the system was letting them down, and frankly, kind of voted to burn the house down. And that's, in some ways, what we got. I don't think that he put forward a real program for how to turn our country into a better direction, though. And so I think that the best way to defeat and end this is through an election. Now, having said that, these investigations may return information that Congress just morally can't ignore. And it may well be the case that they're left with no choice, just in the name of justice, than to begin impeachment proceedings. And obviously, they'll have to make that determination probably quite soon.
I want to bring in Jake Herman. He's a freshman studying journalism at the University of Texas. He's originally from your home district in Maryland. Hey, Jake.
Hey, Congressman Delaney, thank you for taking my question.
Great.
My question is about gerrymandering. My district was recently brought to the Supreme Court because of the way that the district lines were drawn back in 2010. You've introduced legislation to curb partisan gerrymandering in the House, but it never made it to a vote. So you made it clear that solving this is one of your top priorities. How do you plan to get it done?
So it's a great question, and it's a question I obviously know personally because of how my district was created, which I had nothing to do with. But I heard from my constituents after I was elected, both Democrats and Republicans, how upset they were with the partisan gerrymandering. And they're right to be upset. Right? Politicians shouldn't be kind of choosing their constituents. Constituents should be choosing their elected officials. I mean, it's kind of common sense in some ways, right? So I think gerrymandering is one of the most insidious forces in our politics. Gerrymandering combined with too much money in politics, combined with voter suppression, right? It has bent the will of the American people, or has bent the will of the American people away from kind of what they really need. So it's one of my top priorities, and I think a president really needs to run on this. Because I don't think most Americans really understand even how bad this is. Whenever they understand this, no one likes it. Right? No one likes it. The only people who like it are the elected officials who benefit from it. So we need federal legislation to end gerrymandering, and we also need things to get some big money out of politics and deal with voter suppression. But gerrymandering is kind of part of that three-headed monster, and I want to be the president that finally ends gerrymandering in this country. So thank you.
Thanks, Jake. Let me bring in Delaney Harness. She's a PhD student at the University of Texas, Austin. Delaney?
Hi, Mayor Buttigieg. So my question is about the Electoral College. So you've been very vocal about the decay of the Electoral College. From your perspective, what needs to be done to fix the democratic process in America?
Well, thanks. It's such an important question. And at risk of sounding a little simplistic, one thing I believe is that in an American presidential election, the person who gets the most votes ought to be the person who wins. This This is our democracy. I get that we're a representative republic and not a direct democracy. And I can see my Twitter mentions blowing up right now with people reminding me we're not a direct democracy. I know. But if we're not a democratic society, what are we? And if we can't come together with everybody having an equal vote over who the leader of our country is going to be, how can we say that we're a democratic society? We ought to make sure that everybody has the same voice. In Indiana, where I live, because our state's very conservative, most years we have no voice at all in the presidential process. The same is true for some big states and some small states, some because they're liberal, some because they're conservatives, all of them disfranchised and without a voice in the presidential process. Now, your question was a little broader than that. It was about our democratic society and the condition of our democracy. I think it's hugely important, and I worry that it's in decay. You know, the general trajectory of America has been that it became more democratic over time. We extended the vote to more people. We did things like making it possible for individuals to vote on their senators instead of state legislators. You know, that change, actually, in the grand scheme of things, is not that old. And we yet stand now to be a generation that sees democracy in retreat. Even the international rankings by Freedom House of how free and democratic different countries are, we're slipping in the rankings. It's incredibly troubling because barriers are being put up to the ability to vote. Because, let's face it, there are some in politics who think that if more people vote, they're going to lose. I would say that if more people voting means you're going to lose, the problem is with your policies, and you should look to fixing that first.
Let me, I want to bring in Esteban Aviles from Austin. He organized the gaming festival here at South by Southwest. Esteban.
Hi, Mr. Delaney. My question is, how much do you see yourself putting weight into Christian values and the teachings of the Bible in your decision-making as President of the United States?
It's a good question. Esteban, right? Congratulations, by the way, on organizing the gaming aspect of the conference. That's terrific.
It's coming up next weekend.
Oh, it's coming up. God.
Stay tuned.
I firmly believe in the separation of church and state. Full stop. So, a lot of us get our values from our faith, right? A lot of us get values in terms of I'm Catholic. You know, my wife and I and our daughters were practicing Catholics. And to some extent, some of the social justice orientation I have probably comes from that. But I don't think my church and my church policies and doctrines should decide public policy in this country. Because I also believe strongly in the freedom of religion, right? And I believe strongly in the separation of church and state. So I don't think anyone's religious doctrines should inform public policy, but we all know people's faith informs oftentimes how they think about the world. So thank you.
So let me just ask you a follow-up, because I know you're a practicing Catholic. You're deeply involved in your parish. Your party, the Democratic Party, is at odds with your church on a number of subjects, but let's just talk about abortion.
Right.
Now, abortion rights groups consistently consider you an ally, but as a Catholic, is this something that you struggle with at all?
I don't struggle with it as a matter of public policy at all. I'm pro-choice. And I completely support a woman's decision to make her own reproductive decisions about her own body, fully. So I don't struggle with that. I don't struggle with that as a matter of public policy, not at all.
Okay.
You, in the first segment, you were talking about your faith, your Hindu faith, and we have a question from the audience about that. Joseph Ramirez, an audio and visual technician from right here in Austin.
Hi, Tulsi. I wanted to ask, what has your Hindu faith brought into your life? And also, how do you respond to being attacked for being in support of Hindu nationalists?
You know, I grew to understand from a young age, being raised in a multi-faith home. My mom's a practicing Hindu, my dad's Catholic. And so for us as kids, we grew up studying and reading from both the Bhagavad Gita as well as the New Testament. So we heard stories about Krishna and Arjuna at night when we were going to sleep, as well as stories about Jesus of Nazareth. But what we learned from a young age from these scriptures was that real happiness in life can only be found when you're dedicating your life in the service of God and in the service of others. Truly finding ways, no matter what path we chose in life, to make a positive impact on those around us and to be good stewards of our home, to take care of this planet. So throughout my life, I have done my best in different ways to be able to do that, to dedicate my actions, whether it was environmental work in Hawaii as a teenager, running for state house in Hawaii when I was 21 years old, served on the city council, and then of course now in Congress, as well as serving as a soldier in the Army National Guard. I want to address the second part of your question, though. Accusations like the type you mentioned are just another form of Hindu-phobic attacks that unfortunately I and so many others, Hindus in this country, have been on the receiving end of, along with Muslims, along with people of other religions. And it is exactly these kinds of attacks that not only Hindus must stand up and speak out against, but every single one of us, no matter where the attack is coming from or who it is being targeted to. If we want to change this culture of hate and bigotry, every one of us must stand up and speak with one voice to condemn it, because an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
Thank you, Tulsi.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this, because you made a video celebrating the life of the founder of Hare Krishna, who you called your grandfather and spiritual master. You were raised as part of a movement that split off from Hare Krishna. For those who aren't familiar with this tradition, can you describe your faith as it relates to the Hare Krishna movement?
I follow a branch of Hinduism that is the Gaudiya Vaishnava branch of Hinduism. And the teachings and the practice that I live in my everyday life and that are taught by not only my teachers, but their teachers and their teachers and their teachers before them, is essentially what I talked about, is this practice of what's called Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is developing a loving relationship with God. It's a very deeply personal relationship. And Karma Yoga is seeing how can I dedicate my energy and skills and time into the service of others. And there are so many ways we can do that. I was talking with someone last night, a young person who was saying, well, I don't know that I want to get into politics or the military, but I know that I want to be of service with my life. And this practice of Karma Yoga, people are familiar with the term karma. Term means action. So the actions that we take, this means using those actions in a way that is of service and has a positive impact on those around us, whether we work in business or education or healthcare or anything, any of these principles that are universal principles, not limited to Hinduism, can be applied in every one of our lives.
I want to bring in Jordan Brown. He's a journalism PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. Jordan.
Mayor Buttigieg, thank you so much for being here tonight. So I'm a PhD student. I'm also here with South by Texas State. You're 2 years older than me, and I know I don't have my stuff together to be president. So what advantages does your age grant you to being the next president, and what limitations does it offer, and how will you overcome those?
Well, thank you. Maybe I should start with the limitations. So I get that, as anybody would walking into that office, I mean, it's an audacious thing for anybody to think they belong in that office. So when you go in there, you have to recognize just how much you don't know, no matter how old you are, no matter where you come from. And surrounding yourself with people, and more importantly, being prepared to listen to them, is something that served me very well in South Bend, and that I want to bring back to the White House as president. But I also think that age can be an advantage here, if only because it allows me to communicate to the country a vision about what our country is going to look like in 2054. That's the year I get to the current age of the current president. And when you take, okay. It's not like an achievement on my part, it's just the math. But when you take that personally, when that's not just something you're worried about in theory, but you're personally preparing for what the world is going to look like when, God willing, I get to that age, then I think it gives you a different sense of urgency. I mean, we belong to the generation that experienced school shootings as the norm, right? I was in Columbine, in high school when the Columbine shooting happened. I belong to the generation that provided a lot of the troops for the post 9/11 conflicts. The generation that's going to be on the business end of climate change, right? We don't have the luxury of treating climate change like somebody else's problem. We're going to pay the bills for the unaffordable tax cuts for billionaires that were passed by the last Congress and signed by this president. And statistically, we run the risk of being the first generation in American history to actually be worse off economically than our parents if nothing is done to change the trajectory of this economy. To me, that is not just a concern for our generation. It's a concern that calls on us to build an alliance among generations to try to make sure that the future really is better than the past. And you don't get that by promising to turn back the clock. You get that by finding ways to make change work for us before we're all disrupted out of a good livelihood by it.
I want to go now to Kat McCoy, president of the University Democrats at the University of Texas here in Austin.
Hi, thank you for being here, Congresswoman. As one of the many handful of women that are participating in the Democratic primary this year, which female role model has influenced you the most and why?
Great question. There are many. I'm going to share a story about someone who comes from my home state, Congresswoman Patsy Mink. She was a congresswoman who actually held the seat in Congress that I hold today. She made history throughout her life, but she was told no at almost every turn. She wanted to go and be a doctor, but at that time, as an Asian American woman, she was told, nope, sorry, not allowed. She got pretty pissed off about that and wanted to do something about it, so she went and became an attorney instead, so that she could actually fight not just for her own opportunity, but opportunities for other women as well. I could speak on and on about her many accomplishments, but one that has impacted all of us, especially women of our generation, was she was a leader in Congress passing Title IX, making it so that women could compete in college sports, making it so that women could compete in the Olympics, and opening up many doors that previously were very closed. So it's women like Patsy Mink and many others who stood strong in the face of discrimination, who stood strong in the face of hate, and kept their eyes on the prize in making that change, not just for themselves, but for everyone else. Thank you.
Congresswoman, we're almost out of time. You would be the first female president if you succeed in this. What would that mean to you?
I think the more important question is what it would mean to the country, what it would mean to the kind of change that we together can bring about. There are a lot of different experiences that I bring to the table. The most important job that a president has is to serve as commander-in-chief. So as a soldier, as someone who served for over 15 years in the Army National Guard, deployed twice to the Middle East, served on the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committees in Congress, I bring a unique skill set and qualification to serve as commander-in-chief in this country.
Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard.
Let me bring in Jeffrey Meyer. He's a marketing executive and artist from New York City. Jeffrey.
Hello, and thank you, Mayor. Which former president do you most admire and why?
I got to go with Lincoln. There are a lot of former presidents I admire, but we're in this moment of tectonic and deep and difficult change. But whenever I worry about our country, I remember that at one time, part of our country broke off and declared war against the other part. And President Lincoln led us through that, brought us together, and did so with a spirit, I think, of service and empathy that I certainly aspire to emulate in my public life.
I want to bring in Len Edgerly from Denver, Colorado. He's a retired natural gas executive. Len.
Hi, Congressman.
Hey, Len.
You have been visiting with Iowa voters for a year now, and I wonder what advantage do you think that will give you now that many others are entering the race?
So I guess I didn't clear the field, is what you're saying. So listen, I think it's a huge advantage, right? Because I've had an opportunity to listen to people, right? Not only have I had an opportunity to introduce myself to folks, but I've really had an opportunity to listen to people. You know, and I've traveled to all 99 counties in Iowa. I've done 24 trips to Iowa. I've done 14 trips to New Hampshire. And I've sat down with citizens in those states and many other states. I'm going to go to all 50 states as part of this campaign. But you learn so much in people's living rooms, in coffee shops, right, in their community centers, hearing their concerns, hearing stories about what's happened to them. You know, the mom I met in New Hampshire who lost both her sons to opioid addiction. The woman I met in Iowa who has had HIV her whole life. She's in her mid-40s. But because of the Affordable Care Act, she was able to get a job. And now she's actively engaged in her community. It fundamentally changed her life. You know, I was with a police officer in Manchester, New Hampshire last week, and he told me something I didn't know, which is there was a company marketing bulletproof backpacks in Manchester, New Hampshire, because that's how concerned parents are. So having the opportunity to go around and talk to the American people and really listen is a huge blessing, but I also think it's a big advantage in this campaign. So thank you for that question.
We have a lot of questions about your experience. Our first question comes from Gray Monis, a junior at the University of Texas, Austin. Gray?
Thanks for taking my question, Mayor. As someone who's never held statewide office or even represented a population the size of a congressional district, what makes you feel you're qualified to be president?
Well, thanks for that question, and I think that's fair game. I shouldn't be running if I weren't prepared to answer it. But I would argue that being a mayor of a city of any size, especially in the strong mayor system we have in my community, where there's no one else to call when there's an emergency or a major policy issue, is arguably the best kind of preparation you can have. I know that it's more traditional to maybe come from Congress, to have a background in Washington, but I would also argue that we would be well served if Washington started to look more like our best-run cities and towns rather than the other way around. Think about it. One thing you've never heard of is a city shutting down because they couldn't agree on a policy, right? It's literally unthinkable. We would never do it. We couldn't do it because we deliver water, and you need water to live. So we just figure things out. And that's the kind of attitude that I think we need more of in Washington today. I get that it might sound a little cheeky as the youngest guy in this conversation, but I actually think experience is one of the best reasons for somebody like me to be in this. I have more years of government experience under my belt than the president. That's a low bar. I know that. I also got more years of executive government experience under my belt than the vice president, and more military experience than anybody to walk into that office on day one since George H.W. Bush. So I get that I'm the young guy in the conversation, but I would say experience is what qualifies me to have a seat at this table.
Our last audience question comes from Lorraine Schill. She's an office manager from Ohio. Lorraine?
Hey, Lorraine.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. The current president used Make America Great Again as his platform phrase. Do you have a platform catchphrase that will uplift and give Americans hope?
It's a great question. And I hope my team is listening because we haven't decided upon it yet. But so I'm going to be able to say at our meeting on Monday morning, item 1 of the agenda, I think it is time we have the catchphrase. No, seriously. You know, really, my campaign is about focusing on the future. Right? I'm an optimist by nature. I'm a builder as an entrepreneur. You know, I've lived the American dream. You know, I grew up in a blue-collar family. My parents didn't go to college. Because of a lot of people who helped me along the way, I became a successful entrepreneur. I've had the privilege of serving in the Congress of the United States. I've had the great blessing of being married to an amazing woman for 29 years and having 4 daughters. I believe in the life I've lived. I really do. But we need to do things to create that future for all Americans because it's much harder now. This is the first generation of Americans that's not going to do better than their parents. Think about that. Right? Young people today, they want to grow up in a world and live in a world where they can get a good job, where they can breathe clean air, where their environment is sustainable, where they're left with debts they can pay. Right now, we're not doing that. But I know we can. I know it can be much better. But we have to stop talking about things and we have to start doing things. We have to be honest with the American people about the problems and also honest about the solutions. We need someone to bring us together, find the right answer, not the Democratic answer, not the Republican answer, but the right answer. and build a better future as Americans. We have to confront technology, like one of the questions was asked of me earlier. We have to think about where the world is going. And we have to remind the American people that nothing is impossible in this magnificent country, but we have to do it all together. So unlike this current president who wants to turn the clock back to a world that wasn't as good as people think it was, by the way, right, where we had deep divisions, segregation, things that were really scars on our country. I want to be the president that builds that better future, that does the things we need to do to create a better future for my kids, for maybe your children, for all of your children. That's why I'm running for president.
The next question comes from Molly Lynn. She's an aviation professional from California. Molly?
Hey, thanks, Jake. Thanks, Congressman, for taking my question. Hey, the country right now is more divided than it's been in recent history. The political climate is bonkers. What do you plan on doing to be a unifying president? How do you plan on reaching across the aisle to build relationships and form compromise?
Thanks for the question, Molly. And I think it's the central issue we face as a country, is how terribly divided we are. And I think our president really thrives on these divisions. You know, I think you could describe his presidency as pitting American against American. And it's a huge issue right now. I was ranked the third most bipartisan member of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. That's something I'm actually really proud of. I don't think bipartisanship is a dirty word. I think our leaders, and I think the president in particular, should effectively swear never to divide the American people. I think if a president should wake up every day and say, what can I do to bring this terribly divided nation back together? I think a president shouldn't act like half of the country is entirely wrong about everything they believe. We know that's not true. I think a president should be intentional about what they do to bring us together. Right? I've called for national service, not mandatory, but an exciting national service program where young people can serve our country. I think it would be incredibly unifying. I've said in my first 100 days in office, what I'm going to advance is an agenda of 5 or 6 things that are currently bipartisan in the Congress, where good-minded Democrats and Republicans have found common ground and come up with real solutions. I've called for the president debating the Congress once a quarter. The networks would love that, right? Once every 3 months for 3 hours on national television, having a debate with the Congress. See, the American people start seeing who's telling the truth. You know, I think the tone at the top matters. I started 2 companies and I took them public, and I always felt as CEO of my companies that my actions really mattered. And I think the president, more than anyone who has the privilege of serving in this country, has to literally try to do everything they possibly can to unify this great nation and remind us that this notion of common purpose is the beating heart of who we are as Americans.
Congressman, can I just ask you, you said there are five things you want to work on in the bipartisan way?
Yeah.
Just list the 5.
So carbon tax, right? Bipartisan carbon tax, big thing. I've got a bipartisan way of doing it. Infrastructure, right? There's lots of bipartisan ideas around infrastructure. I have one that's received huge support from Democrats and Republicans. We need to do more around criminal justice reform. There's some good ideas to do that. Immigration reform, right? We know there was a terrific comprehensive immigration reform proposal from 2013 that passed the U.S. Senate. It would have passed the House if it had a vote, and President Obama would have signed it into law. It never got a vote in the House. That's on my list. Privacy, digital privacy. There's a lot of bipartisan consensus that we need federal privacy legislation. National service. Right? These are things that the American people agree with each other on. Right? And I want to be the president who leads by finding that common ground and getting things done. Those are just some of the things that could be on that agenda.
And how would you, as a Democratic president, improve relations with the Republicans in Congress? That's always it's a perennial issue. If there's a Republican in the White House, he doesn't get along with the Democrats. If there's a Democrat in the White House, he doesn't get along with the Republicans. What would you do?
You have to work it. Right? I would have a member of Congress over to the White House every morning for breakfast. I know it sounds silly, right? But you have them over, you spend a half hour with them to an hour, you talk about what's going on in their district, talk about how you could work together. You really have to work these relationships. When you're the President of the United States, your client on domestic policy is the Congress. You need the Congress to get things done. So what I want to do is go out to the American people and show them that I have ways of actually getting things done. And I think if the American people actually see that, if they start having more faith in their government again, that it can actually do things to help them, I think there'll be a tremendous amount of pressure from the American people on the Congress to work with the president. So you kind of need an inside and an outside strategy. You work the Congress, and then you go out to the American people and say, these are the things we agree with each other on. Why aren't we doing these things? And that's how you do it.
Once again, and bring in Taylor Horan, a student at the University of Central Florida. Taylor.
Hi. What do you believe has been the biggest policy mistake of the United States since creation?
Wow. Since creation.
Of the United States.
Right, yes. Yes, I don't know that I could go back that far. Well, look, I'm going to point to the one that strikes a chord with me most deeply personally. And it has to do with the cost of war. We are in a situation today where we here in the United States and the world are at a greater risk of nuclear catastrophe than ever before in history. A greater risk today than ever before of nuclear catastrophe. About a year ago in Hawaii, this became all too clear to us. It was January of 2018, right? That's what year we're in. It was January of last year, early in the morning, when there was a cell phone message, an alert that went out to over 1 million phones across our state. And that alert read, "Missile incoming, seek shelter, this is not a drill." So it might be hard for some of you to imagine what went through our minds, but it was terrifying, knowing that we had just minutes to live. Minutes to live. And so we had parents who were piling their kids into cars and trying to drive towards the mountains to see if there was a cave that might provide some shelter and safety. There was a father who lowered his little girl down a manhole thinking that maybe she might be protected there. People trying to decide, who do I spend, what member of my family, which one of my children do I spend the last minutes of my life with? So this alert turned out to be false, but the reason why we reacted the way that we did is because the threat is real. It's as real for us as we sit here today in Austin, as it is for everyone who's watching from home. Our leaders have failed us and brought us to this point. It doesn't have to be this way. We have to correct our course. We have to end this new Cold War and nuclear arms race that is currently being waged, that threatens our very future, and that costs us trillions of our taxpayer dollars, dollars that need to be spent and invested to serve the needs of our people here at home. This is what I'm committed to doing. This is why I'm running for president, to change these policies, to end these regime change wars, end this new Cold War and nuclear arms race, and take our resources and put them where they need to be, in our people and in our future.
So we're going to go to another audience questioner, and we have with us right over here Warren Robinson. He works in the energy industry in Houston. Warren.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. College costs are soaring, and I'm really worried. Here in Texas, even the public universities are $20,000 and $30,000 a year. Not only do I have no idea how I'll send my own kids to college, but I also worry about the way this will impact the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Yeah.
So what are your plans for making college more affordable?
So again, Warren, this is a question that comes up everywhere I go, right? There hasn't been a town hall I've been at where people haven't come forward with this question, which shows how much anxiety there is. And when I went to school, right, if you look at how education has gone up in cost, it's gone up about twice the rate of inflation. So it's much harder for young people today than it was for someone like myself. So there's a couple things we need to do. I've called for what I'm calling pre-K through 14 to be the new K through 12. So I think every kid should start with pre-K as a right in this country. It's the best investment we make. right? It's the best investment we made. We actually need more 0 to 3, particularly for low-income kids. But your question is about college, right? And so I think everyone should have something after high school as part of basic public education. Either 2 years of free community college or some type of career and technical training. Because our kids need it. Last year, the U.S. military said that 70% of the high school graduates weren't eligible for the military. So obviously, what that means is 7 out of 10 kids graduating from high school need something else. So what I call for is free community college. I want to lower the rates on student loans. Right now, the federal government makes money on student loans. I don't think we should make any money on student loans. Right? So I want to charge a rate on student loans equal to the government's cost of funds. So that's the second thing I want to do. I want to have more repayment programs tied to your income. Right? President Obama actually started that, and it was successful. I want to do more of that. You know, so those are some of the things I think we need to do. Because if someone's going to 4-year college now, if that's the path they want to go, and that's not right for everyone, but if that's the way they want to go, if they can get 2 years of community college for free, and then do 2 additional years, and have the rates on their loans be lower, and have creative loan repayment programs, that's going to make 4-year college much more affordable. And then we'll also have a society where everyone's getting something after high school, which is what they need. But just to underscore how terribly unfair this system is right now, the only debt in this country that can't be discharged in bankruptcy is student debt. So if you happen to, unfortunately, have to file for bankruptcy in this country, every debt you have can be discharged, meaning erased by the bankruptcy judge, except student debt. How unfair is that? That shows you how kind of rigged this system is against students, and those are the things I want to do to make a difference. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Let me just follow on that. Sure. The point about students being able to declare bankruptcy, is that the best way for kids to...
No, it's not, but it's more of a point, and I kind of led on this issue in the Congress, in part because I hadn't realized it until I actually had someone in my district tell me about their experience. No one wants to file for bankruptcy, obviously. But the whole point of bankruptcy in this country is that, you know, something happens and you need this process to get a fresh start. We've actually written the laws in this country so that you can't get a fresh start with respect to your student debt. So no, that's not the right thing to do. If people have a lot of debt now, I want to have programs where they can refinance their loans at lower rates and with more flexible repayment programs. But it's more of a point of how unfair the system is. We've got a lot of things in this country, Jake, as you know, that are structurally unfair, right? Where kind of the little guy is getting a bad deal. And this is a good example, I think.
Who recently graduated from business school. He works for a community bank in the Austin suburbs. Tyler?
Thank you very much, Mayor. When Mitt Romney was asked how he would reduce the size of government, he replied, "So I would at least have some structure that McKinsey put in place." As a former McKinseyite, what's your biggest takeaway from your time at McKinsey?
Well, my specialty when I was at McKinsey had to do with grocery prices. So there are some ways that that's relevant and some ways that it's not. What I did learn a lot about was business and the power of business in order to propel prosperity and help grow our economy. And I believe that business, working within the right framework of the rule of law, is the engine of our growth. I also learned a lot about data. And data is something we've got to pay, frankly, I think a lot more attention to in our policies in this country. When we talk, for example, about what's being done with our data, the personal data that we give to tech companies, often there's very little limitation or regulation about what will happen to that data. We need to establish a nationally harmonized data policy instead of asking states to figure it out one at a time. And I think I first got my understanding about the power of big data when it was my job to crunch millions of lines of data related to grocery prices, but I also began studying the way data gets used. We need a comprehensive data law that will establish the rights we have over the value that is being extracted from data that is collected about us, including the right to be forgotten and certain rights over understanding how our data is used and who is accessing it. And that's something that, I know it's not exactly what you probably had in mind when you're asking about McKinsey, but it's something that's on my mind a lot. As to what Governor Romney was talking about, look, we do need to work to make government more efficient. One of the things we did when I came in South Bend as mayor was kind of a banned phrase around the county city building was, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. We subjected everything we do to rigorous analysis because at the city level, I don't get to print money. We legally have to balance the general fund budget. And if I want to do more, we just have to figure out a way to do what we're doing more efficiently, or else we'll have to do less of something else. And sometimes that's the right answer, too. So I think that on-the-ground knowledge of how to get something done that I maybe began to get in the business community, but really put to work in public service at the local level, will be useful at a time when, frankly, in federal budgeting, we're being told we can get something for nothing. And things that are completely unaffordable, like the tax cuts for the wealthiest, are being passed off as though they're worth just as much as things that if we ever do deficit spending would be a better use of it, like investing in infrastructure and education and the things that we know have a payback and will pay for themselves in the long run.
So I want to bring in Bhavesh Shah. He's a digital strategist from California. Bhavesh.
Good evening. Turning the focus to our current president, my question for you is, in your opinion, what is the single most, what's the single most damaging long-term consequence of the Trump presidency?
It's a long list. It's a long list. So for the American people, what he's done to degrade the standards in our society, the fear-mongering, his notion that your enemy is your fellow American, I think that is so corrosive and so damaging. Right? As I said, I think what a president should do is be bringing us together, appealing to, as Lincoln said, our better angels, lifting us up, right? Telling the American people that we can do better, but we have to do better together. Not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans. And I think he's a deeply divisive president who fear-mongers, and his approach is not who we are as the American people. It's not who we are. But I also think what he's done internationally, right? One of the great assets of this amazing country is the alliances that we've developed since World War II. We've worked so hard for 70 years to work with our allies, right, on a value-based approach to building a world order for peace and security. And it has been in the best interest and the self-interest and the national interest of the American people. He has a very narrow transactional view of the world. He doesn't value our allies. He doesn't value the institutions that we've worked so hard to build. He doesn't believe in a values-based approach, right, which is why I believe he lacks a moral compass. So that moral compass, or that lack of a moral compass, animates itself in terms of how he divides the American people, but also in terms of what he's doing to our allies and these institutions that we've worked so hard to build. You know, NATO, things like the Paris Accord that President Obama worked so hard on. You know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I was a big supporter of. So, you know, it's a long list of grievances that I have with him as our president, but I think it's this fundamental lack of a moral compass. I think that will be the biggest lasting damage.
Let's bring in Megan Menchaca. She's a sophomore at the University of Texas at Austin. She's currently interning for the Austin American-Statesman, a great newspaper. Please ask your question.
Hi. As a graduate of Harvard, you were one of the first people to be introduced to Facebook. Since then, it has grown to be used by millions of Americans, but it's also been involved in a lot of controversies involving privacy and the spread of misinformation. Do you believe Congress or the President should be doing anything to regulate increasingly large technology companies like Facebook?
I do, and there are two ways to think about this. The first, and the one that's getting a lot of press these last couple of days, has to do with monopoly policy. It's important for the FTC and other agencies to be empowered to make sure that when a company gets so large that it can use its dominance of one market in order to get an unfair advantage in another, that they can take action on that. But I think the real reason most of us are concerned about some of these companies is that question about data. It's that question of what happens to the information that we often freely give. There's kind of a bargain going on, right? The reason that so many of these products are free for us is that the companies are able to get revenue from the data. It's not even clear exactly how much in dollar terms is being generated from the data that's being collected on us. But what is clear is that it's an awful lot. I think we've all had that experience, right, where maybe you do a Google search on something one day, or you don't even remember searching it. You just remember mentioning that you were out of dog food, and the next day you go check the Weather Channel, and it's all dog food, right? And to some extent, it might seem harmless, but we know that there are other applications that have, of that data that have really raised questions about privacy, and they can even be a problem for our democracy if that data is a national data policy that clarifies these things. We've got to fix that. The Europeans have a model, which I think we should learn from. It may not work to do the exact same thing here, but at least it's a beginning.
Let me just turn to the first part of your answer, because this week one of your competitors, Senator Elizabeth Warren, introduced a proposal aimed at breaking up some of the biggest tech companies, such as Amazon, Facebook. For example, the regulations would force Facebook to roll back deals for businesses when they purchased Instagram, WhatsApp. Do you agree that these businesses are too big and need to be broken up?
Potentially. Again, to me, it's about fairness and competition. So if they're using dominance of one market to dominate another one, then that's a problem. But the size itself isn't the biggest problem in my view. It's not how big they are, it's how they act. And that's the thing I think we need to be regulating and targeting most.
I want to bring in Al Carroll. He's a recruiter in the technology industry from Indiana. Al?
I will be blessed to welcome a second little one in June. I'm also blessed to work for a company that allows me 6 weeks of paid paternity leave. I was the first male at my company to take advantage of the policy, and it was amazing. What plans, if any, do you have to ensure paid parental leave is a right all Americans have access to moving forward?
Great question. Congratulations on your second on the way, and God bless you. You know, my wife and I have 4 amazing daughters, so I know the feeling and the excitement you're feeling right now. And this is really important, right? I think it's a basic right, and we should have paid parental leave policies in this country. And there's a bunch of legislation, including ones that I've supported in the Congress, that effectively create an insurance fund to allow it to happen. So everyone contributes a very, very small amount. Part of their paycheck, we create a national insurance fund, and we allow people to access it. So in my company, I started 2 businesses prior to running for Congress, and I took them public. You know, they were on the New York Stock Exchange. And one of the things I was always really proud of is the benefits that I provided to my employees. It was good for them, but it was also good for the bottom line. And I think people need to realize that not only are these policies good for families and they're good for people, they're also good for our economy. Right? These are smart economic policies. Right? These allow people to be more engaged, have better work-life balance. And so I think it's an incredibly important policy, and I plan to advocate for national policy so that everyone has the benefits that your company gives you, and it's good that they're doing that. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Al. Let me introduce you to Tyler Lenz. Let's go back to some of the audience questions. This is Kelly Blount. She's an accounting professor at Austin Community College. Professor?
Thank you, Mayor Pete. If you were nominated, you'll be the first openly LGBTQ candidate on a major party ticket for president. How do you think that this would affect the lives of LGBTQ people in America?
Well, first of all, I think it helps me to understand what's at stake in politics. Sometimes politics gets covered or talked about like it's just all about the show, especially now because it's kind of a horror show, right? And it's all about who looked good in the hearing and what's going on in Washington, and it's not very much about everyday life. But philosophically, I think the whole point of politics is everyday life. And part of how I understand that is that the most important thing in my life, my marriage, to my husband, who's here, it exists. Yeah, he deserves a round of applause. I'm married to a teacher, so I married up. You know, that intimate thing in our lives exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's a reminder that the freedoms, you know, our conservative friends talk about freedom a lot, but they're always talking about freedom from, as if government is the only thing that can make you unfree. That really important freedom in my life, the freedom to marry, came about because of choices that were made by policymakers who had power over me and millions of others. Now, we got to marriage equality. I would not have guessed that that would be possible. Frankly, when I first got into politics, elected politics at the beginning of this decade, in Indiana, in Mike Pence's Indiana, I thought you could either be out or you could be in office, but you couldn't be both. I came out in the middle of a re-election campaign because it was just that time in my life when I had to do that. Pence was governor. We weren't sure what it would do to my political future. In a socially conservative community, I wound up getting reelected with 80% of the vote. So, but let's be under no illusions. There are attacks on, for example, transgender Americans from the Oval Office, picking on troops, people willing to lay down their lives for this country, not to mention teenagers in our high schools. I can't think of a more, high school is an intimidating and frightening place when you're not transgender. High school is an intimidating and frightening place, right? And, you know, for a transgender teen to get the signal from the White House that the highest officials in the land can't tell the difference between her and a predator and make it harder for her to go to the bathroom shows you just how out of whack the climate is in our country right now. So we've got to end the war on trans Americans, and we need a federal equality act that would say that you cannot be fired just because of who you are or just because of who you love.
I just want to take a moment, if you'll have a seat. I want to ask you about your father, Joseph. We're going to show the audience a picture of him. He was an English professor at Notre Dame. He passed away in January, just a few days after you announced you were exploring a presidential bid. We wanted to take a moment just to honor his memory and also ask you, what did he think about you running for president?
He was excited. He came to this country from Malta, this tiny nation. And someone placed Buttigieg as a common name. And he came here for the educational opportunities that this country offered, and then he became an American citizen after that. He believed in education. He believed in this country, but he also was very passionate about all the ways it was falling short. And so I don't think he ever guessed that I'd be doing this. Frankly, we didn't either until about a year ago. But when I was getting ready to make the announcement, he was already in pretty rough shape. He was intubated at that point. And I wasn't sure about whether to go, but I knew he wanted it to happen. And so I said, I hope I'll make you proud. And he mouthed around the tube, "You will." And I think we are. I'd like to think we are.
I'm sure you're making him proud. May his memory be a blessing. Let's go back to some of the, Let me bring in our last audience question. Allie Runis, a senior at the University of Texas, Austin. Allie?
Hi, Mayor Pete.
Hi.
I want to ask, what do you wish you knew before going into politics and running your first race?
Wow. Well, I wish I knew just how challenging the dimension of money in politics can be. It's not just a public policy concern. It's something that affects the way that people in politics have to spend their time. And by the way, I wouldn't be doing my job well if I didn't mention that since we're not taking corporate PAC money, people who like what they hear tonight should go to PeteForAmerica.com and... Because in order to get invited to the debate stage, we've got to show that we've had at least 65,000 people donating at any level, which I actually think is great because it's not just about how many zillions you can raise, but how many people you can get to believe in the idea you should be there. I'm not sure what I would have done with that knowledge other than it would have been probably even more intimidating. But I guess the other side of the coin is, the thing I've learned through the process, and I wish I could say to myself when I was in my 20s trying to figure out if somebody like me had a place in public life, is that it turns out that everybody, including the most impressive people that you will encounter, deal with, negotiate with, or even compete with in public life, they're just people. We're all just people. And that's what politics is really about. It's why I'm trying to take the way we talk about our politics off of the kind of the Washington show and back to the level of everyday life, because that's why the political process matters, and the more we can keep our focus on that, the better I think our country will be for it.
Just ask you a follow-up if I can. Yeah. Because eliminating or whatever you want to do with the Electoral College, it's not the only radical change you're proposing, because you've also suggested that the U.S. Supreme Court go from 9 justices to 15 to, quote, take the politics out of it a little. Yeah. But how would a liberal president adding 6 justices to a conservative court take the politics out of it a little?
Sure. So what we need to do is stop the Supreme Court from sliding toward being viewed as a nakedly political institution. And I'm for us contemplating whatever policy options will allow that to be possible. One of them involves having 15 instead of 9 justices, but I'm not just talking about, suppose I get elected as president, putting on 6 justices I think agree with me, and then daring the next president, who might be conservative, to throw on a couple more. I mean, that's the last thing we want to do. What we need to do is stop every vacancy from becoming this apocalyptic ideological battle that harms the court and the country. The proposal that I've mentioned, that I think is one of many we should probably consider, it does expand the court to 15, but it changes the structure a little bit. Only 10 of them are politically appointed by Democratic or Republican presidents. The other 5 can only be seated by unanimous consent of the remaining 10. So the idea is that those 5, by necessity, will be those who command the respect of the other 10 across the ideological spectrum and can be counted on to think for themselves. Again, I don't know that that's necessarily the right option. There are others that have been floated that would involve, for example, a rotation of people up from the appellate bench. And by the way, I know you used the word radical in the question, but there are some legal scholars who think this could be done just by statute, not with a change to the U.S. Constitution. So I think that whichever particular mechanism is best, the point is we need to begin the debate on what it will take to make sure our Supreme Court is less political. And I don't think there's anything about this approach that's any more radical than the shattering of norms that Senate Republicans have gone through in order to get the court to where it is today.